Okay, hi everyone in the room and online. It's my great pleasure to welcome Abigail Hackett to visit us here at the Helsinki University and our research group, Children of the Anthropocene. Abi has long been someone I've been looking so much up to, and she's been an inspiration and a theoretical I mean, she has been always ahead in theory and concepts among those who are interested in more than human literacies and early childhood education. I got to know Abi in Manchester several years ago, but now she works in Sheffield Hallam University as a professor of early childhood education there. Early childhood?
It's just childhood. Actually.
Childhood.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for correcting me. Abi is already making impact among young scholars here in Finland very widely. And we are so eager to hear what you're going to tell us about your ongoing projects and your thoughts about participatory research. Welcome, Abi. And once again, sorry for the weather. It's so terrible. Let's not let it disturb us now. So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. So nice to be here. Everywhere I go in Finland, people are apologising for the weather, and don't think you need to remember I come from Northern England, so it's fine. It's par for the course. Hello to people online as well. I hope that you're going to be able to hear me okay. Maybe if there's a problem, type in the chat because you have the chat. Exactly. Right, okay, lovely. I'll focus on talking then. All right then. Oh, thank you so much for letting me come and share my work. And this is particularly helpful because I thought I would talk about some thinking that's in progress. So it's very much emerging ideas, and I'm going to share some different examples from the data, which is what I'm working with and thinking with right now. So hopefully I will time this well enough that we'll have a really nice space for some discussion and some feedback as well, because this paper is definitely very much the beginnings of thinking, I would say. And jumping off from the way this project, Voices of the Future, was framed initially and its kind of promise, and the way in which you have to position research really to kind of galvanize a team and secure funding. So the project had quite large scale funding, so many sort of promises, I suppose, behind it. And then trying to bring that together in my thinking with the way in which events played out between myself and young children and families when we were together in outdoor places, because that was the kind of heart of the research, as I'll go on to explain. So I'm going to talk about some of these emerging insights from Voices of the Future. It's a 3-year multi-site project based in England and Scotland. And the overall aim of the big project, which is led by Professor Kate Parle at Manchester Met, is to investigate the opportunities and benefits of treescapes. So by treescapes, that's not a word that's commonly used actually in England either, but it's used in policy to talk about any different kinds of areas that might have trees. So we might be thinking traditionally about kind of forested areas, but we're also thinking about trees maybe in urban parks, and also even small little bits of open space, or maybe a few trees or trees that are growing on streets. Oh. Yeah. So this idea of treescapes is really a word that's coming from policy and planning, where the UK government are trying to think about trees and how they really organise and particularly increase the number of trees across different kinds of rural and urban locations in the country. So our work was going to use participatory research of children and young people to think about what the opportunities for that process are, and to try to centre the voices of the children and the young people more in the decisions that were getting made. So the overall project has had lots of different work packages and different strands of activity in different locations. But my strand was focused on children aged under 5 years, together with their families, so with their grown-ups. And this strand of working with children who are below school age with their grown-ups in community spaces is a theme that kind of runs all the way through my research. And even though the project's home is at Manchester Met, and I was actually working at Manchester when I started this project, I asked to have the location of my fieldwork be in South Yorkshire, because I've been working in that same place for a very long time. So something about the continuity of going back, even though the families change, actually, of course, and because the children grow up, because I'm working with preschool age children, there's still something about that relationship to a particular kind of space, and maybe a sense of community that reaches beyond the human that we might want to talk about a bit more later on. But that's where I was working. So it's a town, it's a small urban community in South Yorkshire, which is in northern England. And the whole of this research received quite significant cross-disciplinary funding from the UK research councils. And the context of that funding was very much this increasingly urgent calls for some solutions to climate collapse, preferably solutions that don't involve Western societies compromising their lifestyle or getting in the way of economics of growth, and also this emphasis on time running out. So this is a context that I know people in this group are very familiar with and are working with as well. And we were working with this notion in the UK context. So the work that I've been doing, jumping off of this initial proposition and then the field work, is I'm trying to think about co-produced or participatory research about sustainable futures with children and young families, and then some of the tensions and contradictions in this kind of work, which I think are more widely applicable. But I also think, because I'm working with under fives, some of these tensions and contradictions are brought into sharper relief in a really interesting way. So that's one of the things I'm going to try and think about this morning. In relation to childhood and climate change, there's this ongoing tendency, of course, to romanticize the relationship between children and nature, together with what Rebecca Sheldon has called, and thank you, Riikka, for that reference, because I found it really helpful, her work where she's writing about the slide from the child who needs saving to the child who saves. So this positioning of childhood and particular versions of childhood, and what work are those versions of childhood doing in a project called Voices of the Future, right? Which has got this notion of voices that will offer a way forward, and the idea of children being the future, and the idea that participatory research of children is going to offer us some kind of maybe route to salvation. How are all those things playing out is something I've been thinking about a lot. So to do this, I've got some examples today from my fieldwork that I'm thinking of through a couple of kind of interrelated ways in. The first is this kind of fractured form of being off task. So often in co-produced or participatory research, when it's written up and when it's presented, there's this idea that everybody was on the same page and everybody really cared about the issue and kept focused on it. And actually the way that my fieldwork played out was really different from that, where we were frequently not talking about trees at all, or having anything to say about climate change, but following what the children wanted to do in relation to where our explorations with place and materials and arts took us. So there's this kind of off-taskness that I'll give you some examples of as we move into the paper. And then the other related theme I'm thinking about is a kind of non-representational mode of responding to what's happening or responding to and with place. And this idea that I've been thinking with a lot in my previous research, actually, that the way young children communicate or make meaning pulls together lots of different kinds of modes. So as well as language, of course, they're using their body, gesture, movement, play, all these different modes are brought together. But one really important thing is the extent to which these different kinds of modes do or don't pin down meanings or offer something that's very transparent or legible for an adult, or useful, right, for a research question. So how can we pay a bit more attention to the non-representational and the things that seem to be about meaning making, but have this kind of unclear meaning or difficult to translate into the project? So those are the two themes I want to think about today. Yeah, okay. So does that sound all right? And is that clear? Hope it's clear online and everything. Okay, so we'll dig into some of these questions then. Starting with some of these themes, these bullet points, how I'd like to frame it. So drawing on Mack et al.'s notion of transformative science, Routhier et al. Write, once the individuals come to believe that Western science is not the only legitimate knowledge producer, then maybe a conversation can open up about how different forms of research and knowledge production take issues of locality, cultural values, and social justice seriously. And this writing, this paper in particular, has been so useful for us in this project, Voices of the Future, because the project brought together many different kinds of disciplinary scholarship. So we have environmental scientists, social scientists, and humanities scholars all working together around this idea of participatory research with children and the advantages of treescapes. And then in addition to that, so we've already got these kind of multiple perspectives. We've also got this co-produced methodology, which is aiming to centre the perspectives of children and young people. And then we've also got some key external collaborating organisations from the charity and the voluntary sector that bring a lot of other forms of knowing and really important kinds of experiences into the conversation. So really this idea of co-producing the research or centering the perspectives outside of the academy is grounded in appreciation for knowledge outside of the academy. So that sounds great, and is something members of the project are very much committed to. But I also think there's a really important tension there. So we're holding in tension then a commitment to honouring multiple ways of knowing and the perspectives of others, including the children, with the data that the scientists, including the scientists on our project, are regularly working with. Data which we're told clearly spells disaster for the future of our global environment. So these kinds of data and the truths they point towards are already under attack, of course. For example, from the political far right, who seek to discredit or underplay the seriousness of climate collapse. For these reasons, truth takes on a particular significance in research concerned with climate futures and sustainability. It leads to this question from Routhier et al. How could different kinds of knowledge coexist, potentially generating more just worlds? And the way this is played out through the project has been really interesting. We've had some really well-conceived research retreats all the way through the project to try to build this kind of interdisciplinary conversation. And the one that we had right at the beginning of the project, you know, one of the things that came out so significantly for me were these two different positions where we had social scientists coming from the children's experience, the children know, listen to the children, and environmental scientists coming from, yeah, it's going to be lovely to listen to the children, but also this data isn't up for debate. I can't be in a project where we're going to debate whether there's going to be climate change or not. That's, you know, not something that fits with my values. So So how do we take seriously all these multiple perspectives, but also hold some kinds of values as perhaps sacred or not up for debate? And how do we find the balance? And then we have these notions of voice and participation. Within qualitative research, these ideas, voice, participation, co-production, have been taken up together with a growing interest in foregrounding the experiences or the viewpoints of research participants. But at the same time, voice has been critiqued as a solution to addressing power imbalances, making research ethical, or hearing the experiences of others. And in particular, there's a kind of problematic notion of authenticity, which seems to get platted into how voice gets taken up within some qualitative research, including co-productive research, underpinned by conceptualizations of truth as universal or discoverable. So perhaps this idea that children's authentic voices, if only we can listen to them carefully enough or invent some methodologies that can capture them, have this kind of authentic internal universal truth that we'll be able to hear. And this sits really in contrast to an epistemology of knowledge that many of us on the project do work with. Citing Haraway, we might think about knowledge as situated, split, emerging, tenuous, and stitched together imperfectly. As Michael Gallagher argues, when under-theorized, voice and participation risk becoming metaphors for participants' rights and authentic truths. And the other problem with this, particularly from my perspective on the project, because as I say, I was working with the under-5s, and the other aspects of the project were working with children of different ages. So primary school children and with teenagers and with young people actually above school age. So particularly for the under-5s, I've got this problem, which is the conflation of voice with authenticity means that then certain kinds of responses become more useful for the researcher. So for example, those kinds of responses that offer up readily interpretable meanings or address the research questions directly, or support the researcher's own held beliefs or values. So as Riikka et al. Write, often participants of participatory research need both the ability and the compliance to work within adult-determined research frameworks. So where does that leave my work with 2- and 3-year-old children as we hang out and make and play in the park? And as we move into the paper, I'll give you some more concrete examples of what that looks like, which perhaps will, yes, further highlight why this is a problem for my strand of the project. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of sort of these orientating questions or things that keep kind of generatively niggling at me, is this question of how young children in particular have a different kind of way of participating in the world. So we have an emerging body of work from social studies, childhood studies, children's geographies, focusing on very young children, including infants and babies and toddlers, often with this call to take seriously or pay attention to what the youngest children have to contribute. However, I think the question still remains for the whole of this body of scholarship, including my own work. How do we approach taking seriously or paying attention without pinning down meaning? As Omar et al. Described, there's a struggle to include or advocate for young children's perspectives without imagining the solution or speaking on children's behalves. So how do we open something up where the terms of engagement perhaps might feel a little bit more up for negotiation between us and the children? That's something that I'm really interested in. So for example, one paper that I found really useful in relation to this was Boy Cox's work. She describes playful ways in which young children in her ethnography, she writes, generated crazy stories, laugh, experiment with the researcher's authority, and engage in playfulness. So I found this paper really helpful. She writes about working in an early years classroom where the children were invited to play, and then there was bodily movement, like they stopped the activity they were meant to be doing, like the participatory activity, and they all climbed up on a chair and started looking out of a window. And then they also introduced this kind of fart joke that then kept coming up, this joke that was like running through the class, and they all kept kind of circling back to. Boycott points out that introducing fart jokes, for example, could be read as a challenge to adult authority, but it could also be read as a strategy, because introducing playfulness is a useful strategy because it's the children's preferred mode of communication. So I really appreciated this kind of analysis, and it made me think, if we're working with young children and we want their voice in relation to like the benefits of treescapes, how can we make sure we're opening up to preferred modes of communication? And then it was also really interesting to me to think about this in relation to this notion of participatory research. One of the really key pieces of writing that underpins this notion of children's participation is Roger Hart's foundational writing on the ladder of participation, which is a heuristic he offers for considering the extent to which children might be involved in research. The purpose of the ladder of participation originally, and this was, as I say, really foundational writing. We're going back here to the 90s, the reference that I've looked at. The purpose was to guard against trivializing the involvement of children and to provide a framework through which children could take an increasing lead in policy decisions. However, because he's writing generally about all children, Roger Hart actually cites preschool children explicitly as an example of one of the groups unlikely to be able to participate at the higher levels of the ladder. So he writes, for example, the ability of a child to participate varies greatly with his development. A preschool child may be only capable of carrying materials to the playground building site, whereas an adolescent might be able to oversee the entire building operation. And he also writes, it's usually only children in the upper teenage years who tend to incorporate adults into the projects they have designed and managed. So this idea then of what does it mean for children to incorporate adults into projects they have designed and managed, I think it's the thing that has really interested me, particularly alongside the scholarship that we already have around research with young children. Particularly, for example, if we go back to Boycott's writing, and she talks about the introduction of the playfulness and the fart joke into the classroom ethnography. Can we think about the introduction of the playfulness and the fart joke then as a project the children have designed and managed and introduced the adults into? Much of the scholarship around very young children in recent years does, I would argue, offer examples of children incorporating adults into projects they have designed, to quote Hart's original work, and within a wider call. So in other words, the projects that are designed by young children might not be obvious or immediately legible to adults. We need to kind of maybe unpack what that means, what that sentence means, but then more broadly then, what might it mean for children to be doing participatory research in this kind of project? And also, how can we value that as equally useful and equally wanted compared to perhaps the older children that have things that are much more immediately legible or kind of can be seen as sort of relevant to the topic of climate collapse. Within a wider call to nuance how we're theorising then participation and voice in childhood research, I'd argue that doing this kind of ethnographic research with the youngest children is actually a particularly fruitful place to identify and begin to respond to such questions, precisely because it offers this very different lens. If you're not going to just discount or downplay the potential of young children to contribute to the conversation, you need to do much more radical deconstructing about what these things like participation and voice might mean or involve, and who might set the frames of reference for them. So if the frames of reference and the way in which they are able to be recognised are still set by the adults, arguably there's still a lot further we could go, right, in that thinking, down that road. Okay, so I'll try and get down a little bit to some specifics now, and talk about why all of these different particular questions and links to different kinds of scholarship came up for me in this project. So Voices of the Future was one of 6 large grants coming from cross-council funding called the Future of UK Treescapes. And all the projects were therefore very contrasting and brought together different disciplines in different ways. But ours was about a relational understanding of how children and young people related to trees, and then also how their knowledge of treescapes could be translated into a new language of description for these kinds of experiences. And so the different strands of the project activated these questions in different ways. In our strand, because I was working with families and under 5s, I kind of reframed the question to be, what can happen between children and trees? And if we start with that, what can happen, how might that be a jumping off point into these other conversations? So we worked with community partners to run 18 months worth of tree-related sessions or gatherings. Really what we wanted was just events that were going to be really enjoyable and meaningful for the families, but also meant that they could playfully be in the vicinity of trees, and we could think with this question, what could happen? So this is the full list of everything that we ended up doing, but it included things like scavenger hunts, teddy bears picnics, art activities, and woodland walks. And within the much wider Treescapes team, particular members of the team worked with me specifically on this field work. So just this was the team involved in this strand of the field work. So along with myself, Steve Poole is an artist. I've actually worked with him quite a lot in this community before, so it was really nice to work together again. And he does participatory arts with the children. Peter Craftall is a children's geographer, so it was really great to have his disciplinary perspective as well on some of the field work that we were doing. And then Jan White is the director of an organisation called Early Childhood Outdoors. So that expertise in how educators might work with young children in outdoor settings, and also professional development and advocacy for the sector, is something Jan's got many years of experience with. So we all did some of this field work, but I did all of it. And these contacts with this community in South Yorkshire were my contacts. So it's kind of this, well, I say there's this continuity in ways of working. Actually, also, there had been the break of COVID when none of these groups had run. So it was actually a lot harder getting back than I thought. I thought, oh, I've done this kind of work for 15 years and I have these good relationships. And I had the playgroup in mind that I wanted to go back to. The playgroup, which is the main one in my previous book, More Than Human Literacies in Early Childhood. I was going to go back in that playgroup, but it was not running. It's still not running, hasn't been re-established since COVID. And lots of those groups and the links that the organisation had with families were sort of getting rebuilt at the time of the project. So that was another challenge. But yes, we ended up in the end managing to run quite a lot of different activities all around the borough. And one thing we wanted to do, and this is practice that Steve and I in particular have worked with a lot in the past, is to try and make activities that are as open-ended as possible. And we wanted to create as much space as possible for different kinds of reactions and responses and ways of being with the trees. Partly because we thought that would render really interesting data to that question, what can happen between children and trees, you know, with like a lot of different unexpected answers. But also, I would argue the space for newness or difference felt particularly important because the ways that children tend to get imagined in nature or outdoor play are often dominated, certainly in the UK, by this white middle-class lens in which innocence of childhood and the naturalness of certain forms of play in nature really dominate. And that was one of the things that we wanted to try to at least a little bit get beyond in the project. As for Kaylee Nxumalo writes, colonialisms do much of their work through erasures, displacements and exclusions that become normalised in everyday encounters with, for example, outdoor places and spaces, eating practices, encounters with plants and animal life, and everyday play with objects and materials. So there's this kind of erasure, I think, that can happen when we fall too easily into a habitual rut of how we imagine children playing in nature. So we wanted this open-endedness, but at the same time, from prior experience of just what works when you're trying to run something for families, we knew that often families find a hook or some kind of proposition or structure helpful as a way in, particularly when it's kind of an unfamiliar space or a new group. So Steve and I, when we designed a lot of these activities, we were trying to get this balance between openness, but offering a way in, a way of accessing. And we'd often do this by offering invitationally, so optionally, open-ended starting points. So to give you a couple of examples, one of the things I did early on when it was autumn 2022, when I started the work, that, oh my goodness, was so popular, like it was such a big hit. And I just bought paper bags, like little bags for each child, and invited them to fill them with autumn treasures. So the children had the bag and they could collect leaves, twigs, whatever they wanted into the bag. Yeah, all the kids loved that. And it was such a simple prompt. And then when they'd finished collecting, I'd done another little bag that had some nice craft materials like coloured card, glue, different things. And the kids took the craft materials and the autumn treasures home, so they could do sticking and craft when they got home. And actually some of the families also videoed the craft at home, so had another kind of layer of data. So that's a kind of concrete example of the sort of things we were doing. And the second phase, which finished last summer, all through last summer, we ran Tuesday afternoon sessions in the park for families. And Steve was co-running all of those sessions with me. So he'd often do things like bring quite open-ended materials. So you can see here the clay that he bought and these pens that actually we didn't really know how nicely those pens would write on leaves, but we discovered they look really beautiful on leaves. So things like that, or big sheets of paper was something that we worked with quite a lot during the project. So we ended up with all of these kinds of sessions and quite a lot of visual data and also a lot of field notes. And when there was more than one member of staff, we tried to all write field notes, so we'd have kind of multiple versions as well. So this is the data that we have now, and we're starting to try to think about and write up and think about in a field where there's already a lot of scholarship going on, right, around young children and their views on climate change and their interventions into it. What does this project have to contribute? So as I said, I've got these two kind of loose threads that maybe we can explore a bit now in the second part of this presentation. The first one is this idea of going off task. So getting distracted and not focusing on the topic in hand. And then the second one is this idea of voices that are illegible or not representational. What happens when we have this kind of communication going on in place, and how does it help us think about the question? Okay. So firstly, this idea of going off task. So in all these sessions, we offered, as I've explained, these really open-ended propositions, and we try to be led by the children. So because of this, we often found ourselves engaged in activities that had very little or seemingly little to do with trees or climate change. For example, hanging out at the park with families and children of different ages. Maybe the action moves across the grass and amongst toys and art materials around a trunk, focuses on some leaves or seeds, grabs a branch, dumps the branch, runs back to the picnic blankets. Or as we take a woodland walk through the woods, we might gaze up at the beautiful trees and admire them, but then we might spot a friend's Paw Patrol wellies and admire them, and then start to notice that we're cold and discuss what family film we want to watch when we get back to the warmth of our house. When children were offered large sheets of paper and offered to make art, they might start drawing a tree, but then get the urge to write our name or do a doodle. So as the organisers of these sessions, we were aware of this tendency to wander off task. So I'll read you a couple of examples of that happening. Here's one. A little boy sees the pieces of paper that we've laid out for sketching trees, and he has the idea to make a plane with a secret message inside that will fly to Australia. It flies upwards and lands on the awning roof. Steve makes him a different style of plane, and the boy is very enamored and wants to be taught how to do it. So that is what we play. At tidy up time, Steve and I joke that we missed a teachable moment because plane is also the name of a species of tree. So we're saying we should have tried to bring it back to trees, but we didn't. Here's another example. 1 minute, the children are drawing trees on the paper and they're making leaf rubbings, but the next minute they're pushing a car across the piece of paper. So I draw a line with a wax crayon for the car to follow, but instead of curving the line around, instead of following with the car, the curving around line seems to suggest cozy snuggles in the warm sun to one little girl who curls up in a ball on the floor inside the crayon lines and then demands that I draw her a pillow. So I draw the pillow and I draw a bear, and then she wants a blanket. How to draw a blanket because it's supposed to be on top of her. I place a leaf on her as a blanket, but she flicks it away. It's a bit small for a blanket, I say. It's big for a leaf, she replies. Later, a couple of times, she returns to this spot and curls up for a sunshine nap. So these moments of running activities that felt like really good quality sessions that went well and were child-led and the children really enjoyed, and then tidying up and saying to ourselves, there was so little about trees. This happened lots. And mostly, of course, the activities did take place outside, but this kind of centering of some of these sort of big urgent questions that the project had started with, I think we had this sort of slightly gleeful and irreverent, I suppose, realization that they weren't centered. That wasn't what was happening. But then also, actually even more surprisingly to us, sometimes trees seem to flicker back into focus for the children in ways that we weren't expecting. So I'm talking now, see the bottom picture, not the one, that's a drawing of me by a little girl, by the way. But this one here, the one with the green, this is about this drawing. M kneels by the pack of unopened chalks, trying to open them and then appealing to me for help. I mildly point out that there are already open chalks, but he wants these ones, so I open the pack. He says, crack, as I crack open the first pack, and then passes me the next, requesting crack. So we open all the chalks and he chalks on the plastic folder that's holding the consent forms for the research. And when it doesn't show up very well, I pull out the spare consent forms and invite him to scribble on the back. I scribble too. I encourage big, bold marks, and part of me delights in the official documents getting defaced. Steve then passes the paint pens, and Em draws a picture on the back of one of the consent forms in green, but then he passes me and he names the picture 3 trees. And this seems like such a surprise because it feels like we haven't been talking about trees much. Although I had been going around with the consent forms to the parents earlier on and saying something like, we're looking at how the children play and what they do outdoors with the trees. And I was kind of collecting consent. How strange then that either intuited this or heard it or picked up. And then he did something with the consent forms and this tree straight after that. So Em choosing to draw these pictures of trees was a surprise to us, even though maybe it shouldn't have been. The children had enjoyed playing in the vicinity of the trees and they'd enjoyed the art materials, but there hadn't been very much focus on the question of trees so far in any of the sessions. Also surprisingly, Em's picture seemed to start a trend, and the following week, several older girls also drew different kinds of representations of trees without us asking. The bigger girls were all drawing trees. I said to Em, "Look, do you remember you drew trees? You were the first one to do it." He shrugs. Anne draws in black with stylized branches and twists and spirals. She draws eyes on her trunk and her sister teases her, saying, "Where are the eyelashes?" And this joke about the lack of eyelashes then sort of becomes this joke that gets picked up by myself and the kids and the parents, like in future visits. So trees and eyelashes, okay. Something for the policymakers, perhaps. Despite these strange eruptions of tree-related creating, it remains the case that many deep moments of engagement, creativity, and energy from the children were not focused on the trees or nature or climate change, not seemingly anyway. Welcoming these moments at the time, but then disregarding them at the point of data analysis as not useful or not relevant to the research question seems both hasty and disingenuous. It also risks recreating or over-representing a kind of child or a mode of participatory research in which participants enduringly remain engaged and on task, and the methods work really well. And we see this mode of singular focus, clear messages, and united perspectives from the group as seeming to be generally overrepresented in the literature on participatory research with children. Either it's overrepresented, or when I do research with children, they go much more off task than average. I'm not sure, but I think it's probably overrepresented. What do we do with this kind of off-topic data then? Like the tension between valuing children's voices and knowledge, but holding that alongside the irrefutability of the scientific data about climate collapse. There seems a difficult to resolve tension between an approach to participatory research that is led by the interests of the child, grounded in slowness and playfulness, and then on the other hand, the urgency of climate collapse, the need to focus on finding actionable approaches and solutions. We need a solution for improved carbon capture in the UK. We cannot wait whilst children launch paper planes to Australia or take sunshine naps. So how do we hold these things in tension? Stacey Lomo has critiqued the tendency for researchers' response to environmental sustainability to tend towards technocratic solutions. She asks, how might we disrupt a discourse of fixing things and finding solutions? And then I'm also interested in this idea of how we story things as well. So when I talk about the overrepresentation of children that did have something to say about trees and say they care about the climate and have something that responds to the research question, I think one of the things that's going on here, one of the things that's at stake, is how we as researchers choose to story what happens in those kinds of moments. Singh et al. Write about the importance of stories as a route to imagining different planetary futures. They caution some stories help us notice, others get in the way. And they identify the hero narrative in particular as one that risks overwriting complexity and centering human exceptionalism. So the disruption of both technocratic solutions and the positioning of either research or humans as the hero in the narrative that will discover the technocratic solution. Maybe disrupting both these things is necessary in order to dismantle or help to dismantle an ontological imagination in which humans are masterful, separate from, and capable of controlling and fixing the planet with our supposedly superior ingenuity. So from this perspective, perhaps we can think about these small overlooked stories and moments of being off task as some kind of counter narrative, but I'm still very much thinking this through. So I would be really keen to discuss this a bit more at the end. Yeah. So perhaps from this perspective, the off-taskness of children's engagement in our study isn't a methodological inconvenience or something to put up with because it's about building relations before we get to the meat, but rather it offers a shift in how we conceptualize both childhood and the role of the human in shifting human planetary relations. Working in an unstructured way with children in outside spaces and insisting on describing this lack of focus or off-taskness in the fieldwork, and that being part of the conceptual frame rather than neating it up for publication, feels potentially like a political move that we could make in our project because it resists the portrayal of children as a generative source of new solutions to be tapped. So I've got, check how we're doing for time. We okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got another bit of data, but it's on video and I might break everything now. Shall I try?
Escape.
Yeah.
Click that and see what happens. I have to double click it and open it.
No
What
way.
is that doing?
Oh,
Okay.
Where's he going? Where's he going, do you think? Good, everyone's come back. Which is your favourite one?
It was, well,
okay. I'll explain what's happening and then we could look again if we want. So this bit of footage we collected on the last of the sessions that we did over the summer holidays. So we did every Tuesday art activities in the park. And on the last one, we wanted to make something like a celebration of the children's work and share some of the early findings from the project. So we had organised a picnic, and you can hear the music in the background. We'd organised some musicians to play, and we had strung up strings between the trees and displaying all of the children's artwork that they'd made during the previous sessions. And the ribbons in the trees were actually, they were an idea that hadn't worked. So because it was the last session, we thought, should we do something where we kind of explicitly try and ask people what they think about trees, because we haven't really done that. So we had this idea to have the ribbons and have pens and invite people to either write down what do you love about trees, or what have you liked about these sessions, or any other feedback on the ribbons. That was the original idea. Didn't work because the pens, the ink just bled too much into the ribbon. So you could make marks, but you couldn't really write. So actually that's not on the ribbons, but the children still tied many ribbons into the trees and then they're blowing in the breeze. The way this footage was captured was Steve lay down under the tree with his camera and filmed upwards, just because he thought it would be kind of an aesthetically nice bit of footage that we might want to use at some point. However, seeing a grown-up lie flat on the grass, little Em, who is 3, came running over like what? And he and I ended up also lying under the grass, on the grass under the tree. So the 3 of us are lying under the tree and looking upwards. And I'll play it again. I think I must be silent, but you can hear Steve's voice, but you can hear Em. And Em is babbling and vocalizing in a way that seems so strongly to mirror the wind and the movement of the branches and the leaves. And some of what he says isn't recognizable as words, but there's an up and down and a melody to it that seems so in tune with the rest of the more than human. And there's lots of giggling, but there's also a story. So if I play it again, you might be able to hear. Steve says something like, "What is it? What's it doing?" But Em rephrases it as, "Where's it going?" So he goes, "Where's it going?" And he's talking about the ribbons. And then there's little bits where he's narrating, like, "Where's it going? It's going away. That one's going. It's coming back again." So there's kind of like a story where the ribbons are the protagonist, but it's not just the story. It's also mixed up with this kind of embodied vocalization about this. Really, it was a beautiful, special experience of lying there. So let's listen again if we can. Do you know where it went? I'm not good on maps.
I think we went over here somewhere and then here. Was this what you hit last time?
Um,
No. No, we don't want to watch that.
oh, it's there. Look. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
How's it going? How's it going, do you think?
She was older than him. Nice pointing.
Good, like one's come back. What's your favourite one?
It was, well,
I was going to try and get the, can I do that and get the slides back? Does that work? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I only have a few thoughts on the video. I'll share what I've got to so far, but it's more of a maybe an interesting discussion starter. The moments of unraveling under the trees felt magical in a way, as all three of our human bodies were absorbed in something bigger, this moving and sounding in response to the sky and the wind and the tree branches, and then these flapping ribbons, which the children, as I say, they tied them to the tree. Em's vocalizing seems to mirror the more than human movement of the wind and the ribbons. It's really difficult to transcribe the words and the babbling, but there is a story in there about the ribbons running away and coming back, but it seems to be elusive and fragmentary and not a whole story. Just as in the previous section where trees as a kind of topic seemed to come in and out of focus while the children were playing and making, in this encounter, there's a narrative about the meaning of the trees and the wind, but it seems to come in and out of focus. A posthuman perspective complicates notions of voice and this idea of the bounded, rational individual. And that adds to some of the other critiques that I raised earlier about what's the status of voice then in research. Instead of only an articulation of rational subject positions, language from a more than human perspective is something that we could see as material, issuing from bodies and not belonging to bounded individuals. As a bodily act, there's always something in language then that exceeds representation and meaning and resists interpretation. I think there are certain views of voice or participatory research or co-production that rely on or overemphasize this idea of a bounded, singular speaking subject. I think Maggie McClure puts it nicely when she describes this idea of a subject who knows who she is, says what she means what she says. Do we demand or prefer this of children in participatory research? And what does that do to how we're able to story what's happening in this kind of research? A focus on voice as bodily and more than representational unsettles this traditional approach in qualitative research that aims to interpret what the participants really meant or diagnose lack in either the participants or the research design when this task is difficult. So that's what I kind of said earlier when I said, you know, maybe it's just my research that doesn't stay on task, but I don't think that's the case. The tension around wanting to identify what the participants really meant is brought into sharp relief when we're researching with young children. Orman et al. Warn that if research over-focuses on ideas that are easily articulated in spoken words, some children risk being obscured by the verbally expressive child. So this mode of like dominant forms of language or child expression or childhood, I think we could sit these as problematics alongside overly represented or dominant modes of what it means for a child to be in nature. So these kinds of white middle-class modes of being in nature. So I would add to this that certain modes of being in the world also risk being obscured by the over-reliance on verbal expression and by modes of naming and narrating the world that are particularly valued in Western industrialized societies. Thus, we could view co-producing research with moving, gesturing, playful children, not as some kind of methodological puzzle, and if we solve it, we'll be able to get some legible statements about the children's views. Instead, perhaps such moments have something to teach us about the assumptions and preferences that underpin our models of participatory research. Often it feels like in this kind of research, the focus, as it's written up anyway, the focus seems to be on an issue all the parties care about, and they have something to say about it. And when the findings are presented, it seems like the participants were fully focused on exploring and understanding that singular issue. In other words, a technocratic approach to co-produce solutions dominates. If we consider these off-task, distracted moments and these illegible but something magical or this kind of data that definitely pulls to me anyway, as forms of a different kind of narrative or storying, can we also think about how these narratives, these counter-narratives, might exist outside of human language? And is this what we're seeing in this kind of vocalization in place, like in the video? Yeah. So some concluding thoughts. Singh et al. Urges to explore different modes of storying, pay attention to what they set in motion or enable us to notice. So there's been these moments of drawing and playing and chatting and lying under the trees all the way through my fieldwork. And when I tell them, it seems like there isn't really a narrative arc. There's no overarching takeaway message, and it's difficult to pull the threads together. As stories, these examples seem to refuse to explicate, instead remaining in the language of place, as gesture, reciprocity, play, and movement. These moments seem to offer a version of learning with or from children that do not involve children responding within the parameters predefined by adults. And therefore, these stories that offer a kind of incommensurability, requiring us to respect what we encounter in the middle of a complex, entangled situation, rather than giving us the ability to stand back and survey the component parts. This feels like an unproductive or productive response to some of the tensions that are highlighted at the beginning of the paper around voice, participation, co-production, and urgency in environmental research. Participatory research, I would argue, continues to be haunted by the need for children to engage with and communicate about the matter in hand in particular ways. For example, these terms of engagement often include that participants should be rational, they should focus on the relevant topic, and they should be legible to the adults involved. As Rauti et al. Ask, the question of what we mean by participation is thus crucial. Our research has prompted us to ask questions about the models underpinning co-produced and participatory research with children, particularly when we connect this with the urgency of environmental sustainability. A preference for modes of participation that are rational or task-focused and voice that is a legible representation of authentic truths might position the children that I work with in my study as less desirable research participants, or perhaps it positions me as having a less desirable mode of doing research. As Ormam et al. Have argued, if we are to include all children in, they say, the concept of the child, we must, though, resist exclusionary or hierarchically arranged concepts of childhood, which have historically worked to exclude children of colour, working class children, and childhoods in the global south, amongst others. As Lee writes, life can be uncomfortable for children who do not live up to the hopes invested in them, or whose existence fails to console the adults around them. Roger Hart's original ladder of participation warned against trivialising the involvement of children or their contribution. We would agree, but we would add to that by arguing that in order to avoid this, to avoid the trivialising, we need to hold on to the radical potential of children's involvement to reframe the nature of the inquiry itself, rather than fit their contribution into a neatly designed adult box. Carrying materials versus overseeing the operation, for example. Rather than accepting that working with younger children leads to less useful responses to questions of environmental sustainability, we propose that this problematic helps us to question our assumptions and perhaps to ask some useful questions about the status of childhood, futures, the human, and also how we might imagine human-planetary relations. I'll stop there. Thanks.